Hi everyone, so this video is going to talk about sample space. So sample space is a straightforward concept, but this is a vocabulary word that you're going to need to be familiar with. This is probably a new vocabulary term, but it's an important one when it comes to probability. When you talk about probability, you are often performing some kind of an experiment and then determining the probability of different things that could happen in that experiment. The sample space of an experiment is a set of all its possible outcomes. So what the sample space does is it just tells everyone what could actually take place. So if we think about an experiment like, let's go really simple, like flipping a standard coin. So nothing special about the coin, just a regular old coin. So if we flip a coin, the outcomes or the results of that experiment could be heads or tails. Those are the only two things that could take place when you flip a regular old everyday coin. This list is referred to as the sample space for that experiment. So we're going to look at two ways of determining sample space. For a simple, straightforward experiment like flipping a coin, sample space can just be a list. So when you're talking, not super complicated kind of experiment, you can probably figure out what the sample space is and just list them. So over here you'll see we have this little container, and inside the container there are different numbered cards. So the experiment is that we are going to pull a random card out of this container. So randomly we're going to reach in, grab one, pull it out. So the list of possible outcomes, or the sample space of this experiment, the possible things that could come out of this are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. That's the sample space. Sometimes you will see sample space represented with parentheses around it. What you cannot do is you cannot say that the sample space is 1 to 5. That is no good. Each of the actual individual outcomes need to be listed out. So we would say possible outcomes are 5. Possible outcomes are 5. There are 5 possible outcomes, but the sample space is the list of them, the actual what could happen. Not the number of outcomes, but the actual things that could happen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this case. Heads and tails in our previous example. So for simple, straightforward experiments, often you can just generate your sample space by logically working through a list. When it comes to experiments that have two things going on, so maybe you are flipping a coin and at the same time you are also maybe rolling a die. So there are two components to the experiment. Component 1, which is flipping the coin, component 2, which is rolling the die. When you have an experiment that has two parts, a two-dimensional grid could be a good option for you to show the sample space, because a two-dimensional grid will have both parts of the experiment on it simultaneously, and then the grid that is created identifies each of the possible outcomes. So we have two spinners here, spinner 1 labeled off 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have spinner 2, which is labeled off A, B, C. So if we wanted to make a two-dimensional grid to illustrate the sample space for this particular experiment, we're going to draw ourselves a grid, and on one of the axes we will put one of the parts of the experiment. So spinner 1 will go on our y-axis, and we will put spinner 2 on our x-axis. So then, for each of them, you are going to list out what could actually take place. So the results of spinner 1 could be 1, 2, 3, or 4, and we're going to extend out lines from each of those. And then on the other axis, we're going to put the outcomes for the second part of the experiment, and we're going to draw lines across there. So at this point, I'm going to tidy this up a little bit, make it look a little bit neater. Okay, so then the last part that you have to do, and yes, you have to do this, is you're going to put dots where each of the outcomes from the different parts of the experiment overlap with one another. Each of those dots represents a possible outcome. So each dot equals possible outcome. So if you count up the number of dots, this has 12 possible outcomes, which makes sense, right? Because we had spinner 1 had 4 outcomes, spinner 2 had 3 outcomes. So we multiply them together, and that's where we get our 12 possible outcomes altogether. So what the grid does is it shows you what all the possible outcomes are. So if you take one of the outcomes in particular, let's take this one for example, that outcome means a 3 on spinner 1 and a B on spinner 2. So this particular possible outcome is 3B. So you don't have to then take the information from the grid and list it all out because all of it is already there. When you label your axes appropriately and accordingly, then all the information you need is already there. Each of the dots representing one of your possible outcomes. Okay, so let's go through a couple of questions, sort of putting that all together into practice. So our first question says, list the sample space for selecting. And then we've got 2 different scenarios. So in part A, we are selecting a disc from a bag containing red, pink, white, and brown discs. So similar to what you would do when you come into my class for a new unit. You're going to select a disc from a bag. So the possible outcomes of you selecting one disc are just red, pink, white, or brown. Those are the possible outcomes of the experiment of choosing one random disc out of this particular bag. Secondly, we've got list the sample space for selecting a 2-digit multiple of 5. Okay, so multiples of 5, 2 digits. So let's think about the multiples of 5. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, and so on and so forth. So we're looking for all of them that will be 2 digits. Okay, so we can cross out 5. That's not going to work, and we got to keep going. So if we need this to be 2 digits, then we got to keep going. So 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, and 95 will be our last one. All right, so a 2-digit multiple of 5, if we want to use the parentheses around these, is any number from 10 to 95 on our list here. So we've listed out all the sample space if you randomly ask someone to pick a 2-digit multiple of 5. Okay, last example we're going to look at. A coin is tossed and a spinner with equal sectors numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is spun. Use a 2-dimensional grid to show the sample space of possible outcomes. Okay, so we've got to have a grid with a coin on one side and a spinner with 5 sectors on the other side. So let's put coin over here, and we've got heads and tails. And then we'll put our spinner on the other axis with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we'll extend our lines over from heads and tails, extend our lines up from our spinner numbers. We will erase off that. And then last but not least, we will put dots. Each of those dots, remember, represents a possible outcome for this particular experiment. Okay, and that does it for this video.